The day started at 4:30 in the morning when it was still dark outside and cold enough that you could see your breath hanging in the air like small clouds that disappeared into the blackness. This was when Britain's milkmen began their day, before the streets woke up and before the lights came on in houses, and before the world remembered it needed them at all. Jim Matthews had been a milkman for 32 years, driving the same streets in Manchester on the same route past the same houses. And by 1995, he was one of the last remaining because doorstep delivery was ending and supermarkets had finally won the battle for Britain's breakfast tables. But for 3 decades, 5 days a week without ever failing, Jim had driven those streets in complete darkness and delivered glass bottles with foil tops and been an essential part of the quiet morning ritual that made Britain what it was. This is the story of the last milkman and the world that disappeared when he stopped coming. Jim's day always started at the depot at precisely 4:30 in the morning, where his milk float was already loaded with metal crates stacked high and bottles clinking together in the pre-dawn silence. Other milkmen were there too, starting their own routes, though once there had been 20 of them working together, and by 1995 only 4 remained on duty, and they didn't talk much to each other anymore as they checked their loads carefully and drove out into the dark, empty streets to begin their rounds. The milk float could only reach 15 miles per hour at its absolute maximum speed, which meant it moved slowly and steadily through the empty streets with the distinctive whir of its electric motor and the constant rattle of glass bottles and metal crates, creating the familiar sound of milk delivery that hadn't changed at all in 50 years of operation. Jim knew his route so well after all this time that he could have driven it completely blind if he'd needed to, turning left out of the depot onto Wellington Road before heading straight down to the estate where his morning deliveries were waiting for him. After 32 years of driving the same streets 5 days a week without variation, those routes and streets had become part of him in a way that was genuinely difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't done this particular work themselves. He knew exactly where every pothole was that could upset the bottles if you hit it wrong, and which curbs were higher than others and needed extra care when pulling up alongside them, and which sharp corners required you to slow down considerably so the stacked crates wouldn't tip over and send bottles crashing to the floor. All of this knowledge was stored deep in his muscle memory from years and years of constant repetition until driving the route had become as automatic and natural as breathing itself. The first street on his route was always Winston Avenue, a long row of identical terraced houses where he had exactly 19 deliveries to make before moving on to the next street. Jim would pull up carefully to number 12 and lift 2 pints from the back of the float and walk up the narrow path to place them gently and quietly on the doorstep where they'd be waiting when the family woke up. The bottles would clink together softly in the darkness, never loud enough to wake anyone sleeping inside. Just a small sound marking his presence there, before he returned quickly to the float and drove another 10 feet forward to repeat the entire process at the next house in line. By the time he finished all 19 deliveries on Winston Avenue, his hands would be absolutely freezing from handling bottles that were cold enough to almost burn your skin when you picked them up, and his breath would be coming out in thick, visible clouds that hung in the still air around him. But he never rushed through his work even when his fingers went completely numb, because rushing through deliveries meant making unnecessary noise, and making noise meant potentially waking people up from their sleep, which completely defeated the whole purpose of what a milkman was supposed to be and do. Milkmen were meant to be exactly like ghosts who appeared and disappeared without being noticed by anyone at all, leaving what people needed and taking away the empty bottles from yesterday before anyone even knew they'd been there at all. The essential job was to be present but completely invisible, necessary but entirely unnoticed, absolutely essential but taken completely for granted by everyone. Mrs. Patterson at number 7 always left him handwritten notes on Fridays that were tucked carefully inside one of the empty bottles she left out for collection on her doorstep. The notes would say simple, straightforward things like, "Extra pint, please, Jim. Grandchildren visiting this weekend, and they drink so much milk it's unbelievable." He'd read the note carefully and nod to himself in understanding, and add the extra pint to her regular order without needing to be reminded again the next day. And the following week there would be another note waiting for him that said something like, "Thank you so much, Jim. They drank every single drop." These were small interactions that never happened face to face because Jim delivered milk long before dawn when Mrs. Patterson was still asleep. but the notes felt genuinely real and meaningful despite their simplicity and brevity. Over all the years, he'd come to know her routine and patterns even though they'd never properly met or had a real conversation. Knew exactly when her grandchildren came to visit and knew she always made her first cup of tea at precisely 6 o'clock in the morning because she'd once mentioned it in a note years ago. Mr. Davies at number 14 had developed a completely different system over the years where he left exact change in an empty bottle every Monday morning without ever being a single penny short or a penny over the correct amount. For 18 years straight, this routine had continued without a single missed payment or mistake. And when Mr. Davies died quite suddenly in 1993, his adult son had taken over the house and continued the exact same tradition his father had carefully established decades earlier. The money still appeared like clockwork every Monday morning in an empty bottle on the doorstep of number 14, and Jim still collected it and counted it carefully and marked the payment in his worn leather-bound ledger book before moving on to the next delivery. Jim had attended Mr. Davies' funeral service and stood quietly at the very back of the church without speaking to anyone or making his presence particularly known. But he'd felt strongly that he should be there, because in his own quiet way, he'd known the man quite well. He'd known Mr. Davies' routines and patterns intimately, knew when he wanted extra cream delivered and when he went on holiday each summer, knew all the small, accumulating details of his life that you inevitably learn about someone when you see physical evidence of them every single day for 18 years, even though you've never had an actual face-to-face conversation with them. The milk float's electric motor hummed steadily and reliably as Jim moved methodically from house to house through the sleeping streets. The sound so deeply familiar after all these years that it had become like background music he barely consciously noticed anymore. He'd been driving this same exact float for 12 years straight and knew every single quirk of how it handled and responded to his commands. The company had tried introducing diesel vans back in the 1980s because they were considerably faster and much more fuel efficient than the old electric floats. But customers had complained loudly and persistently that the diesel engines were far too loud and disruptive in the early morning darkness. The noise from diesel engines would wake people harshly from their sleep when they wanted to rest peacefully for another hour or two, whereas the milk float's gentle electric hum didn't disturb anyone at all, and most people could sleep right through it without ever knowing Jim had been and gone. They'd come downstairs later in the morning and find their milk bottles waiting patiently on the doorstep without having heard him arrive or leave, which was exactly how the service was supposed to work in practice. He'd finish Winston Avenue by 5:15 when it was still completely dark outside, then move on systematically to Radford Street where he had 12 deliveries to make before continuing to Clemson Road, with its 23 scattered houses spread further apart. By 6:30 in the morning, the first kitchen lights would start coming on in windows as early risers woke and began making their first cups of tea using the milk Jim had delivered silently an hour earlier, without them knowing. Some people would wave at him warmly if they happened to see him through their kitchen windows, but most never noticed he was there at all, because he'd become such an expected and unremarkable part of the morning routine, as reliable and ordinary as birds beginning to sing or dawn beginning to break over the rooftops. Winter mornings were always by far the hardest part of the job to endure physically because darkness lasted until 7 o'clock, and the bitter cold bit right through his gloves, no matter how thick they were, completely numbing his fingers by the time he reached the 3rd Street on his route. He'd have to pause between houses and flex his hands repeatedly and blow warm breath on them to restore some filling before he could continue handling the frozen bottles safely. The milk float had absolutely no heating system installed, just an open cab that let the wind blow straight through relentlessly while he drove from house to house for hours. By the end of a winter route, Jim would be frozen absolutely solid from prolonged exposure to the harsh elements. But complaining about the weather wasn't something milkmen ever did, because this had been the fundamental nature of the job for over 100 years, and everyone who'd done it before him had dealt with exactly the same harsh conditions. Summer mornings brought their own different challenges as the heat made milk go off faster, requiring quick, efficient deliveries before the sun got too strong and spoiled the product sitting on doorsteps. But regardless of the season, the route itself never changed and the routine remained absolutely constant year after year. The supermarkets began changing everything, starting in the early 1980s when people gradually realized they could buy milk considerably cheaper and more conveniently at the store, instead of waiting for scheduled doorstep delivery. At first, it was just a few customers here and there who canceled their orders with apologetic explanations about tight household budgets. And Jim completely understood their reasoning because saving 30 pence per pint really did add up to significant money over the course of a full year. But slowly and steadily over the following years, the numbers kept dropping as more and more people made the practical switch to buying their milk from Tesco or Sainsbury's, leaving increasingly visible gaps on streets that once had milk bottles sitting on every single doorstep. By 1995, Jim's route had shrunk dramatically to approximately half of what it had been just a decade earlier in 1985, and the depot had been forced to close 3 of its 5 delivery rounds and lay off 15 milkmen who'd worked there faithfully for many years. Jim had survived the cuts only because he had seniority over younger workers, but he could feel in his bones that his round would be the very next to close because 40 remaining deliveries simply couldn't justify the ongoing costs anymore. The company called him into the office on a Tuesday morning in November 1995, and Jim knew before the manager said a single word what the meeting was going to be about. "Jim, we're closing the Manchester depot permanently at the end of this month," the manager said with visible discomfort and genuine regret in his voice. "I'm very sorry, but the numbers just don't work anymore, and there's no way around it." Jim simply nodded in quiet acknowledgement, because he'd seen this inevitable conclusion coming for many months and wasn't particularly surprised by the announcement. "What's going to happen to the customers who still depend on regular deliveries?" Jim asked immediately, thinking about the 40 families who genuinely relied on him showing up every morning. "We'll contact all of them and try to arrange alternatives," the manager explained somewhat vaguely. "There's still a depot operating over in Bolton that might be able to cover some of the Manchester area." The carefully chosen words "might" and "some" told Jim absolutely everything he needed to know about what would really happen, which was that most of his customers would have no choice but to switch to buying their milk from supermarkets. Jim collected his personal belongings from the battered metal locker where they'd sat for 3 full decades, a dented thermos he'd used every single day, a waterproof jacket that had seen much better days, and a heavy torch for navigating the darkest winter mornings. It didn't seem like very much at all to show for 32 years of dedicated work. The other 3 remaining milkmen came over one by one to shake his hand firmly and tell him they were genuinely sorry to see him go. And they meant every word because they knew their own turn would come soon enough. November 30th, 1995 was Jim's final working day. Cold, dark, 4:30 a.m. The same as every other day, but completely different because it was the last. He did his route one final time, driving slowly through every street, trying to remember everything. Mrs. Patterson at 7, Mr. Davies' son at 14, the Harrisons with their twins. 40 doorsteps. 40 families trusting him. When he finished at 8:30, the sun was up. Jim sat in the milk float for 10 minutes, memorizing the streets. Then he drove back, parked, handed over the keys, walked away. 32 years done. The last milkman in Manchester had delivered his final pint. What was lost? More than milk. There was trust between strangers that doesn't exist anymore. There was community knowledge. When Mrs. Patterson didn't collect milk for 3 days in 1989, Jim knocked and called her son, who found her with a broken hip. The milkman saved her life by noticing. There was ritual in morning sounds. Clinking bottles, the hum, the cold glass, the foil cap. When that sound disappeared, a piece of Britain disappeared with it. The last float was sold for scrap in 1996. The depot became a Tesco in 1998. Jim died in 2004 at 68. His funeral was small. Customers didn't know. He'd been invisible, which was his job. Do you remember the milkman? The sound? The bottles? When mornings had rhythm? When you trusted strangers? If you remember, then Jim isn't gone. Share your memories. Subscribe for more stories about the Britain we lost.